their adoption. And this paper came about because of this puzzling phenomenon that lots of people are adopting generative AI, but not everyone is. And there's lots of hand-wringing by companies in the public media about how it's slow to adopt generative AI, how they're struggling to adopt it, they're not really getting productivity benefits out of it. So there seems to be sort of variation in terms of how much companies are able to adopt these things successfully and how much benefit they're getting out of it. And we get some hint for why this might be from the existing literature, which is that it matters how much companies are adapting to a new technology for how much of a productivity benefit they can derive from it. And I'm going to try to take this one step further and argue that what this actually induces is a path dependence between different technologies. If one technology changes the way a company does things and changes the way a company operates, then it might make it easier or harder to adopt the next technology that comes along. So there's some sort of path dependence between technologies, which I'm going to call an organizational technology ladder. I'm going to use a natural experiment to try to understand this connection between sequential technologies by exploiting the fact that remote work hit the world like a rock and maybe paved the way for generative AI. Why would that be the case? Remote work enables generative AI through various different channels. On the one hand, lots of people argue that jobs that are done remotely or virtually might be easier to automate through generative AI. At the same time, when you adopt remote work, your company might be investing in infrastructure and capabilities more generally that make it easier to adopt new technologies and generative AI in particular. And so I'm going to use this natural experiment where remote work forced some companies where the pandemic forced some companies to adopt remote work and therefore might have changed the makeup of their technology capabilities in order to look at whether or not that might have paved the way for generative AI in these organizations. And so I'm going to ask whether or not this organizational technology ladder or one technology implementation actually makes it easier to adopt the next one actually exists. Can we find causal evidence of that? And what might be the mechanism for what's actually going on in companies that might link different technologies to one another? And I'm first going to show you an IV estimation that shows that remote work actually causes greater generative AI adoption. Then I'm going to show you an estimation that supports the idea that generative AI adoption in turn actually reduces remote hiring. And I'm going to provide you both a conceptual framework and then some mechanisms for why I think this is happening. And the mechanisms will focus on organizational adaptation, so how an organization is changing its work processes and the kinds of skills that its employees have, and how that makes it easier or harder to adopt the next technology, and also pre-existing differences in management quality, where some companies are just better set up to benefit from a new technology. The data that I use for this is mostly job postings data. Generative AI adoption in this context means the share of a firm's job postings that mention generative AI-related skills. I'm also going to talk a lot about remote work usage, where analogously, remote work usage is the share of your job postings that mention that the position is remote. And then I'm also going to mention a number of different job characteristics and skill characteristics of a firm's hiring that I'm drawing from various sources in the literature. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about these job postings and generative AI skills? Here's an example of this. So this is a job posting for a product specialist associate at a real estate fund. And this product specialist associate job posting mentions that this particular position utilizes generative AI, specifically JLL GPT, so they seem to have some sort of internal chatbot to support and optimize specific tasks and initiatives within the organization. So we can tell from this job posting that this company uses generative AI to some degree, and that this particular position seems to be designed to interact with generative AI to some extent. And so we can use these job postings to draw conclusions about how this company is using particular technologies. And I can tell you the story of this paper in basically two pictures, these in terms of the correlations. So the first one is that companies that adopted remote work to a larger degree, so whose remote work share changed a lot between 2019 and 2022, are more likely to then also adopt generative AI after ChatGPT is released. And I have data here for third quarter 2022 to third quarter 2024. So if you adopted remote work more aggressively, you also adopt generative AI more aggressively. Afterwards, when you're adopting generative AI during that time period, remote work actually declines in the places in the occupations, industries, firms, you can cut this whichever way you want, that are adopting more generative AI. So remote work goes down during the time period when generative AI is adopted. And in the paper, I basically support the story told by these two graphs with fancier estimations. On the one hand, we might worry that this is not a causal effect, right? Of course, lots of companies are simultaneously exposed to remote work and generative AI because they're tech companies, they have pre-existing technology capabilities that somehow apply to both of these. They're in a particular sector of white-collar work where both of these are useful. And so unobserved company characteristics might drive adoption of both of these technologies. I try to address this through two channels. On the one hand, I throw in all the controls one might think of. So I can control for industry fixed effects. I also have an occupation by firm analysis where I can put in firm fixed effects and occupation fixed effects. I control for how suitable the firm's jobs were for remote work before the pandemic, how suitable the firm's jobs are for generative AI, how skilled their workforce is, how much they hired for technology skills, anything I can sort of think of that might be controlling for this idea that some companies are just sort of tech savvier. I also develop an instrumental variables design where we can use the idea that labor market pressure might force some companies to adopt remote work to a larger degree than others. Remote work is perceived by workers as a benefit. And so if your workers perceive remote work as a greater benefit, or there's more pressure from sort of external factors to make your company provide this benefit to its workers, we can get some exogenous variation in terms of which companies are actually forced to adopt remote work. And I'm going to use two flavors of this. On the one hand, I'm going to focus on labor market competition by constructing an instrument that is based on the idea that if there are lots of other local employers that are remote friendly, that have jobs that can easily go remote, and your company can go remote in theory as well, based on its pre-existing employment structure, that should put a lot of pressure on you to actually offer remote work to your employees, right? There's lots of other local employers that are offering remote work. You could offer remote work. That might make you more likely to offer it to your employees. The second factor is commuting time. If your workers have really long commutes, there might be a lot more pressure for them to be able to work from home so they don't have to commute into the office 5 days a week. And so I construct another instrument based on the idea that if your workers have long commutes, that might induce exogenous variation in the adoption of remote work. And in particular, what we care about here is that this is an excluded instrument, right? So that commute time before the pandemic is unlikely to be a driver of generative AI adoption 4 years later, controlling for all these other characteristics of firms, other than through a channel that leads through remote work adoption. Okay, and I also construct analogous instruments for firm by occupation variation by interacting this with a national share of remote work adoption in different occupations. What do I find? So when I use this instrumental variable approach, I find that remote work adoption in a firm is associated with much higher generative AI adoption after the release of ChatGPT. So about a 10 percentage point increase in remote work is associated with about a 0.6% increase, percentage point increase in terms of generative AI skill demand. This is pretty large because generative AI skill demand is sort of in a single-digit percent here. And this is even larger within firms. So within firms controlling for firm fixed effects, we see an even larger impact on exactly those occupations within the firm that adopted remote work more aggressively. Those are also the ones where generative AI skills are then demanded to a larger degree. And now we're going to flip this around. So what happens after generative AI is adopted? What happens now to the remote workers? And so I want to estimate what happens after the ChatGPT release as a sort of an event study. How do firms with high exposure to generative AI behave differently from firms that are not as exposed to generative AI? And so we can run this as a simple event study. Of course, there's a big problem here where difference estimation of this form normally assumes some notion of parallel trends. So we have to assume that remote work trends are the same between firms that are highly exposed to generative AI and firms that are not exposed to generative AI before the ChatGPT release. And that's obviously false here, right? Like we wouldn't expect, for instance, tech companies that have lots of generative AI exposure to have the same remote work trends as non-tech companies. And you can plot this in a graph. If you just sort companies by generative AI exposure, the ones with high generative AI exposure have these really steep increases in remote work before the release of ChatGPT. You do see the declines afterwards that sort of seem to coincide with the release of ChatGPT, but there's definitely like differential pre-trends going on here. How do I address this? I use a methodology called synthetic difference in differences, which is basically about the idea that we can try and deliberately match these companies on having the same pre-trend in terms of remote work, and thereby sort of construct a synthetic control group that is identical in terms of previous remote work trends, and then look at what happens to that group that has the same remote work trends but different generative AI exposure. What happens to that group after ChatGPT is released? And what you find is that once you do this matching, you get rid of these pre-trends, and you find that there is a big decline in the remote work share among the companies that have the highest generative AI exposure after ChatGPT is released. And this is mostly driven by an overall decline in hiring and an even larger decline in remote hiring. Okay, I don't have time to fully go through the conceptual framework. This is a short talk. I'm just going to leave you with the two key ideas here. The two reasons why I argue this happens are that on the one hand, you get a technology ladder because IT infrastructure is reusable. Once your company invests in a data backend, IT, various engineers, you can use those engineers to also implement generative AI after they've implemented a remote work infrastructure, right? And so because of that reusability, you get a technology ladder where implementing one technology makes it easier to implement the next one. You can also explain technology substitution. If your company changes its work processes to fit a particular technology, here generative AI, I'm going to assume, actually leads you to restructure your work processes to put more emphasis on human decision-making, right? The chatbot is now doing a lot of the execution work, and humans need to make better decisions and do more of the planning and coordination about what work needs to be done. That restructuring of work processes makes remote work less convenient because you need to do more coordination between humans, and in-person coordination is easier than remote coordination. And so it makes it more likely that you're going to shift back to in-person work because you've changed the part of the work that is still being done by the human workers. And I find evidence for that when I look at the mechanism for what's going on here. So I look at what actually happens in terms of the skill demand and the skill composition when firms adopt remote work. And what I find is, and I'm going to show you several graphs that all have the exact same structure with the same skills. I'm going to look at upskilling in terms of education, communication skills in different dimensions, individual decision-making capabilities, tech skill investment, so are you asking for data science, machine learning skills, and so on, and management skills. Are you hiring for more managers or for more leadership skills? And so when firms go remote, they hire more educated workers. They hire more for individual decision-making because those workers are now sort of on their own, and they invest a lot in new tech skills and in more managerial skills. And it turns out when we look at what skills are associated with generative AI exposure actually translating into you using generative AI as a company, those are exactly the things that are associated with companies implementing generative AI more aggressively. So higher tech skills, higher management skills, more individual decision-making, and more education are exactly associated with generative AI exposure translating in actual generative AI adoption in this analysis. And we can also see evidence at this micro level for this technology substitution. Why do some firms then go back from remote work and adopt and reduce their remote work share after adopting generative AI? I find that is more likely to happen. So this technology substitution is stronger in firms that, on the one hand, heavily invested in the tech skills, right? So it's easy for them to adopt generative AI and sort of switch technologies. But also, it's particularly prevalent in firms that are badly adapted to remote work. The firms that sort of are not set up for this, right? Firms that have bad individual decision-making, bad communication skills, and low managerial skills, those are the firms that are more likely to go away from remote work as well. And so I then also find that this substitution effect is much larger in the firms that are unadapted or in tech-savvy firms, right? So firms that are less well set up for this. And as a last thing to show you, one good proxy, I think, for firms that don't like remote work are firms that have return to office mandates, right? Those are firms that have come out and said, we really don't like remote work. It's not working out for us. For instance, JP Morgan. And so if you look at what happens for firms that have a return to office mandate, it turns out that this effect of remote work on generative AI adoption is about twice as large for the firms that have remote work, that have return to office mandates, right? So those firms are much more aggressive about investing in generative AI because they really don't like remote work. Okay. And that's already it. There's sort of three key takeaways I want to emphasize. There's a technology ladder component where there can be path dependence between technologies. You change your firm in response to one technology, and that then makes it more likely or less likely that you're able to adapt a new technology. There's technology substitution, where incorporating one technology might make an old technology easier or harder to use. And there's a lot of inequality in terms of adoption, where you can have leaders and laggards in terms of technology adoption. And as a result, very unequally distributed productivity benefits, and there are important policy and management implications, right? That if you have these sequential technologies that you want to incorporate and that need to interact with one another, you need to build out the organizational muscle in order to do that kind of innovative change up in your work processes. And so both from a policy angle and from a managerial angle, you want to be able to build out this ability to change your organization in response to new technologies and think strategically about what it is that you need to change in order to incorporate multiple technologies or how these technologies interact. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. We doing questions now or after?
We have time for 2 or 3 questions. In terms of the company's strategy, did you see anything where it was a negative impact from your strategy at all?
In terms of strategy, what do you mean?
Strategy prior to remote work, after.
I've not looked at that yet. It's a great idea, though. I think it's a good question. It's like, so the next step here should be like, okay, I looked at skill demand and skill composition and org structure and so on. There are probably other aspects of strategy that might matter, right? There's some sense of innovativeness that we can probably measure from earnings calls and sort of other company documents that might play a role here, and that might be interesting. Yeah, good idea. Yes.
One, to get copies of these slides.
Yep.
Should we email you, or that's one question?
Yeah.
The second one is a little more important. There are many firms now that want to jump up the ladder without having the foundation. What advice would you say, I'm not a company like that, but what would you say about those companies that think they can go from level 1 to level 5 just because they want to adopt Gen AI?
I think my takeaway from this research actually would be that in some cases that might be not a terrible idea, in the sense that if generative AI uses very different work processes than what your company would have otherwise, maybe you were sort of avoiding this detour through other organizational setups, right? Like you can sort of go straight towards an organizational setup that is complementary to generative AI. And you see this sometimes with this idea that new startups, for instance, are able to have much more decentralized organizations. You can do a lot more you can have much flatter organizations, for instance, with generative AI, and there might be a hard path of going from a more hierarchical organization to that with a lot of sort of pain and infighting along the way if you had to go that route. And so in terms of, I think, the work processes part, I think that's actually, maybe it's helpful to start with a blank slate in some sense. On the other hand, one takeaway from this is that existing technology capabilities and kind of knowing how to build internal infrastructure is not something that comes overnight, and it's something that you want to build out. And so maybe your employees might already have that from other contexts, but companies that have never incorporated any technologies, right? They have 2 guys in the basement who know how to use SQL, and their database is a spreadsheet that's emailed around. They're probably not going to jump towards like fully automated AI agents overnight, and it would probably be a mistake for them to try to do that.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
One quick question. There's a huge literature on technology outsourcing, task decoupling, task interdependencies, and so forth. So isn't there sort of something similar to some of these Gen AI adoption patterns that you're talking about? And the fact that a company that has already done remote work is likely to have gone through that learning curve. So how do you address those kinds of effects in your study?
So there's definitely already a large existing literature on sort of like how companies incorporate technology. I think there's sort of 2 things here that I would like to highlight that I think are different in this context, which is that on the one hand, I think this connection between technologies has not been drawn out as much. Like it's usually studies focus on sort of one technology. And I think the thing that I think is kind of interesting here about what's going on is that both remote work and generative AI are not traditional technologies in the sense that like you put them into a warehouse and they execute a particular task in a particular way, right? It's like they're much more work process focused, and they change sort of the way that that organizations are structured. And having two of those happen rapidly in quick succession, I think is sort of a somewhat unique setting.
Well, and just to follow up on that, okay. I wonder whether the framing is to say technology 1 and technology 2. They are the species of the same technology. It seems to me that there is something else that is going on, and related to the point that you just made, it connects to modularity. I mean, what I'll be saying tomorrow is that areas where you see the biggest impact in terms of Gen AI with regard to disruption is modularity. And the reason that Ethan Mollick's excitement does not translate to the world is that Ethan focuses on things that are very modular. The world is not modular, sadly. And what you see here is that with the transition home, you separate inescapably. And as such, you can start schlepping things off and then seeing what these bundles are. So I wonder whether the probing, theoretically speaking, shouldn't be, rather than say technology A, technology B, what is it specific to this transition that may help us understand theoretically better? So I'd be a little bit more ambitious in this and not generic in saying what is a technology.
I think that's a great idea. I like that framing of sort of like making organization more modular. That's part of the key thing that's going on.
Probably is quite relevant there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.